Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
It's a busy time for federal retirements. From rising healthcare costs to the surge in retirement applications, there's a lot to keep track of. And OPM has launched a new online retirement system at the same time. Here to explain what makes a retirement case clean, how to avoid common delays, and what federal employees should be thinking about before they hit submit is Tammy Flanagan, principal at Retire Federal. Tammy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. It's great to be back.
Hey, I want to start with a listener issue. We've talked a lot about managing your pensions and purchasing power, but we don't often talk about it from the perspective of folks who might have retired at a lower grade. And so, a lot of them are experiencing this loss of purchasing power as healthcare inflation outstrips COLA. Can you talk a little bit about some management techniques that you would recommend to help kind of balance that?
Sure. Yeah, I know we kind of get jaded in the D.C. area because there are so many high-grade positions, and it seems like the average federal employee is making well over $100,000 a year. But you go outside of the Beltway, and that's not necessarily the case, because I have met people in military installations who are working at GS7, GS5 level positions, and they're hard workers, and they do end up working 20 or 30 years, but yet their pension, especially under FERS, you figure if your high three is $60,000 and you have 30 years of service, that's only an $18,000 a year retirement. So when you have to start deducting health insurance and dental and vision and pay for Medicare out of your Social Security, there's not a whole lot left. And I think that was the gist of this listener's comment. So I was looking at the health benefit premiums, and I know a lot of employees, a lot of retirees have difficulty thinking ever of changing their health plan. But there's a big difference between, let's say, Blue Cross Standard Option, which for a self-only plan is now running $378 a month, versus one of the Aetna plans that work really well with Medicare, if this listener is at the Medicare age yet. And for example, Aetna Medicare Advantage plan is $115 a month. That's less than 1/3 of the cost of Blue Cross. And this plan will give that listener back $125 a month towards the cost of Part B, almost covering the cost. So there's ways you can manage those lower retirement benefits, and hey, for that matter, higher retirement benefits. Why should anybody pay more than they have to for really good health insurance?
That's really helpful advice. And so for our listeners out there, I hope they'll take that to heart. And I really appreciate you doing that research for us. Next question is something you and I have talked about, and it's coming to fruition now and in the next couple of months, is an accelerated number of federal retirees. We talked about the online retirement application. How's that going right now?
Yeah, well, I've been hearing from people who have now filed their online retirement application. Some of them had contacted me earlier saying, I already sent in my paper forms and now they're telling me I got to submit it again electronically. Why is this? And they were griping. But then I heard back from a few of them saying, hey, this was actually smoother than I thought it would be. It seems like this is going to help avoid mistakes, which I think it will. And I think there's some checks and balances there. So when you're filling out the online application, it's going to prompt you to go to each section that's necessary for you to fill out. It's going to tell you what attachments you need to put on that application, such as your marriage certificate or possibly a divorce decree or military records. So I think all in all, it is going to save time on the front end of the process, meaning that the employee is going to have a better experience submitting the application. The agency is going to also have those same checks and balances when they submit the whole package to OPM after that employee retires. So I truly think it will save some time in the front end, avoiding some of those common mistakes that we typically see, like forgetting to sign the application, or you didn't check a certain box, or the agency not sending health benefits information, for instance. They just didn't get it in time or whatever. So I think that will help. I don't know how much it's going to solve the problem of the actual processing for employees who have really complicated career histories or divorces, or they're under something like civil service offset or law enforcement, or they had part-time service. So that problem is still going to be there. So some of those employees will still wait, 3 months, if not longer in some cases, for their retirement to be processed. But those simple cases, those straightforward, clean cases, as I like to call them, those should go quicker. I think people will be really pleased to see how quickly their retirement might be processed now.
I'm speaking with Tammy Flanagan. She's a principal at Retire Federal. Any helpful advice for folks who might have been out of government a while before they submit this package? You're talking, I think, from a perspective of someone who's just now leaving federal service and has their agency HR group to help them. What if it's been a while and now they're just submitting that package?
Yeah, we are seeing not only people who have already left, but people who are in the process of taking the deferred resignation who are not necessarily going to be applying for retirement. These are the folks who might be eligible for a deferred retirement, or maybe they're eligible for what we call the MRA plus 10, but they want to avoid the age reduction, so they're going to postpone the application. In that situation, you're kind of on your own. You're going to fill out the old paper form, which you can fill out electronically, but you still have to print it on paper and mail it to OPM. You're on your own with not getting that assistance from HR, which a lot of employees still do receive. So you got to be really careful to read the instructions carefully. If you haven't left federal service yet, those folks who are leaving the end of September, be sure to take as much documentation as you can. Proof that you've had health benefits for 5 years, your beginning and ending dates of your federal career, anytime your work schedule changed. You want to be able to have the evidence of that career, that health benefit coverage, so that when the time comes to apply and receive that benefit, you get what you've earned. And if you don't, you have something to argue with because you have all the proof of it.
Yep, I can only tell you from my case because I applied for mine earlier this year after having been away from government for a while. I had my whole personnel file and I was able to find all the documents, but then it went super quick. It was easy online and OPM settled it, but I might have been ahead of the retirement wave. What are you seeing now in terms of volume? Is OPM able to keep up with the number of retirees they're facing right now?
Well, it'll be interesting because in May and also at the end of June, there were huge numbers of retirements, like 3 times the number of that same month in 2024. So OPM is getting deluged right now with all of these applications coming in much earlier than they would have expected. And I think part of that had to do with the threats that were included in the Big Beautiful Bill proposals that never came to fruition. But we were so scared, that they were going to happen before July 4th. So a lot of people pulled the plug and said, I'm going to get out of here a little bit before September 30th so I can still have my high 3 and all the things that we do still have because none of those were in the bill that became law. So, yeah, I think OPM is going to maybe slow down a little bit, especially, like I said, on those more complicated cases because those are going to start to pile up. The easier ones, just like with anybody who has work on their desk, if you see something that you can get done pretty quickly, you'll get that off your desk to kind of make your numbers look a little better. So I think the simple cases will still go through pretty quickly, but I think those complicated cases, you got to be careful. I think it's going to take longer. You got to really look it over when you get your benefit to make sure you're getting everything that you've earned throughout your career. So just really review everything carefully before you sign it or before you just accept it.
That's really important advice. And I want to take retirement kind of one step farther because as you go through the retirement process, you're making some decisions about benefits for your survivors. What do survivors of federal retirees need to know in terms of making sure that they close out that case correctly?
I think it's important for the retiree to leave behind instructions. I know no one wants to think about, what happens after they're gone, but to really help your family, whether it's your spouse or your children or your sister, whoever it is that's going to handle those affairs, let them know that there's the thrift savings plan balance. Let them know that there's either a survivor benefit or maybe just your last retirement check. How do they get that? Because you're not going to get your last check because it's always paid the month after you die, right? So leave those instructions, leave OPM's number. In fact, retirees, like you got this too, Terry, I'm sure, that retirement booklet.
Yep.
And in the back of that booklet are all the numbers you need and all the websites that you'll need to review. So even if that's the only thing you leave behind, that's going to help your surviving spouse claim the benefit with OPM. Retrieve that money from the TSP account or understand how that works when there's money left in the thrift. And even to the point of applying for Social Security survivor benefits or widow's benefits. So it's important, I think, to have that conversation at some point. Find peaceful, relaxing time to bring it up and sit down and just show them where this stuff is. I remember when my mom was getting older and she took me in the bedroom to that box that she had in the closet and told me what was in it and what I might need to do, when the time comes. And I'm so glad that she did.
That is so important. So as we think about cleaning out our basement so our children don't have to do it, having those kinds of conversations is one thing that can happen at the same time. Tammy Flanagan is a principal with Retire Federal. Tammy, thanks as always for your great advice.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks again.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former senior advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business. And more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge? And how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.